Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Welsh Ecclesiastical History Seminar, which today is being co-hosted by the University of Wales Trinity St David's, Oxford Brookes University, and the IHR's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. It is really lovely to have all of those who I can see online and all of those of you who are in the room who I can't see, but I am sure that there are many of you there. In a minute, I am going to hand over to Bishop Wyn Evans to introduce this evening's speaker and seminar. But just very quickly, I am Dr. Ruth Slatter from the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community at the IHR. And as I quickly said before we all started, just a few practical notices. If you are online, please make sure that you are muted during the seminar. There will be time for questions at the end of the seminar. Those of you who are in the room, normal things, raise your hand or etc. Those of you who are online, there is the Q&A function where you can add a question in there. You can add a question in the chat, and I think you might also be able to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and then me and various members of the team who are in the room will also help to manage those questions. And as I said, please be aware that this session is being recorded. So over to you, Wyn.
Thank you, Ruth. Wel, ga dechrau oedd o'n mae yn fraint ac yn bleser arbennig I groesawu bob un ohonoch chi i'r ystafell mae heno, pob sedd yn llawn ar lle dan ei sang am y tro cyntaf I wedi gwir. Dyma'r bumed yn y gyfres o seminarau hanes yr Eglwys yn Llambed, sydd wrth gwrs wedi deillio allan o ddathiadau 200 lwyddiant y brifysgol ar y campws hwn. Ond yn arbennig ar ran pawb sydd yn bresennol, mae'n bleser o mwyaf cael croesawu yr Athro Francis Knight, sydd wrth gwrs yn holl gyfarwydd I nifer ohonon ni ar y campws hwn, oherwydd iddi hi, cyn iddi fido I Brifysgol Nottingham fod yn benneth adran diwinyddiaeth ac astudiaethau crefydd y Brifysgol ar y campus home. And it's a real pleasure, therefore, to be able to welcome all of you here, every seat full and the room indeed full, both in this room and also, of course, abroad. My thanks to Ruth for the link with the IHR for embracing this series of seminars, of which this is the 5th. And it is a particular pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor Francis Knight, who was, before her migration to the University of Nottingham, head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies of this university on this campus. I will say it's one of the leading church historians of her generation, a distinction recognized indeed by the Learned Society of Wales, into whose fellowship she was inducted in 2022. Her interests lie in the history of Christianity in the West in the 19th and 20th century, with a particular focus on England and Wales. And indeed, her most recent book is on Ebenezer Howard, pioneer of garden cities. I notice she's also just done something, one of my favorite theologians, Henry Scott Holland. But this evening, she's going to be focusing on 2 leading figures, if you like, in the ecclesiastical history of Wales, both of whom, in their various ways, were linked to this campus. Connop Thirlwall, its Episcopal visitor when he was in post, and Alfred Ollivant, who was, of course, before his elevation to the See of Llandaff, its first vice-principal. Croeso, Francis.
Well, thank you, Wyn, for that extremely generous introduction. And thank you to everyone who's taken the trouble to log on or indeed come to Lampeter this evening on this particularly damp evening. It's a great pleasure to come back to Lampeter to speak at this joint meeting of the IHR's People, Place and Community Seminar and the Welsh Ecclesiastical History Seminar. And in an attempt to meet the objectives of both seminars, I'm going to talk about ecclesiastical people, Connop Thirlwall and Alfred Ollivant, and places and communities that are mostly in Wales, with a brief diversion to Cambridge. Born 18 months apart, educated at the same college and spending most of their adult years in Wales, they lived the parallel lives alluded to in my title. But I have in mind another type of equivalence. Their lives unfolded in ways which parallel something in the modern experience. I'm going to suggest that they were prototypes for a modern form of Welshness, by which I mean an identity that can be taken on by those who come from outside Wales. Ollivant and Thirlwall relocated to Wales for work reasons. They both immediately grasped the significance of their new context, adopting a Welsh sensibility as a distinctive part of who they were. Theirs was quite a contemporary tale of migration and shifting identities. Both were men of considerable achievements, but I can only very lightly sketch them here. Thirlwall, historian, classicist, theologian, and linguist, was regarded as one of the brightest men in 19th century Britain. Ollivant was an able Hebrew scholar who also very successfully managed the remarkably challenging Diocese of Llandaff. This evening, however, I'm focusing more narrowly on the question of how they took on Welshness, how they used and defended the language, and how they began to think about questions from a Welsh point of view. Now, if you're familiar with the historiography, you may be thinking, but surely Ollivant and Thirlwall have always been seen as the last generation of English bishops, controversially rewarded against a growing chorus demanding that Welshmen be appointed. Yes, and I'll be coming back to that later. But I want to suggest that rather than following the grooves of the familiar narrative, there may be something to be said for looking at them from a slightly different direction. So let's start with their parallel lives. Thirlwall was born in London in 1797 and Ollivant in Manchester in 1798, although his family soon moved to London. Both were educated at London public schools, Ollivant at St Paul's and Thirlwall at Charterhouse. Both of them then entered Trinity College, Cambridge, Thirlwall in 1814 and Ollivant in 1816. And it's at Trinity that they must have first encountered each other. They were, however, very different characters and unlikely, I think, to have moved in the same circles. Ollivant was and remained an evangelical. He attended the meetings of Charles Simeon, the towering father of 19th century Anglican evangelicalism, who exerted a formative influence over generations of pious undergraduates. Thirlwall, we may safely assume, did not find his way to Simeon's tea parties or sermons. As we shall see, he loved languages, and at Trinity he taught himself Italian and spent his evenings studying German with his school friend Julius Hare, his future theological enemy Hugh James Rose, and the future master of Trinity, William Whewell. Thirlwall felt sure that learning German would prove useful for something, although he was not quite sure what for. He graduated in 1818, winning the Chancellor's Medal for Classics. Ollivant graduated as 6th Wrangler in 1821, which was a higher classification than Thirlwall's, and with prizes in Hebrew, as well as the Chancellor's Medal for Classics. Both of these bright young men became junior fellows of Trinity almost immediately. Thirlwall went on a continental tour. He had been absolutely desperate to see Europe. He'd never been abroad. And there he tried out his German on a Welsh woman. She was Frances Bunsen, wife of the famous German diplomat, cousin of the Cambridge Greek professor, J.H. Monk, and sister of the future Augusta Hall, Lady Llanover, very well connected. And Frances Bunsen provides a very perceptive portrait of the 22-year-old Thirlwall, very eager, very cerebral, and also rather awkward, straining to do his best to join in the German conversation. The son of a clergyman, Thirlwall had originally assumed that he would be ordained, but he decided against this while he was at Cambridge, and returning to London, and with no enthusiasm, he began on a legal career. In spare moments, he put his German to good use by translating Schleiermacher's critical essay on the Gospel of St. Luke, for which he supplied a 154-page introduction. Thirlwall never wrote short. It was published in 1825, and it is an extraordinary and very significant work. In it, Thirlwall lays out for the English-speaking world some of what would become the basic and still important questions of New Testament scholarship. Which texts came first? What sources were used? Was there an oral tradition? Well, the desire to return to Cambridge to resume academic work grew ever stronger as he realised just how dull he was finding his legal career. And at that date, a college post usually meant ordination, and Thirlwall was ordained in 1827 at the age of 30. Some people expressed surprise, but he told his uncle that it was simply a change not of substance, but merely of circumstance and accidents. Thirlwall returned to Trinity just as Ollivant, who was now an accomplished Hebrew scholar, was vacating his post in the same college and leaving Cambridge. And this was because he had been appointed vice principal and professor of Hebrew at the newly opened St. David's College, Lampeter. Well, I would love to know what Ollivant thought as he arrived in Lampeter, quite probably by sea. The poor man actually lost many of his books in a shipwreck when he was transporting them to Lampeter on a slightly later occasion. But what did he think as he contemplated the newly built college quadrangle dropped into the Cardiganshire Hills? He brought his Simeonite evangelical piety with him, and he became known as an able and conscientious teacher. For the use of his students, he published an analysis of the Hebrew text of Genesis 37 to 50, the Joseph narratives. And the extensive notes make it clear that he was using Welsh grammatical forms and comparisons to explain Hebrew to the students. He had begun learning Welsh immediately. His biographer, John Morgan, tells us he was an early riser and not unfrequently would, in the winter months, light his own fire and prepare his own cup of coffee. Among other studies, he entered on the acquisition of Welsh, and in his walks about the outskirts of the town, would encourage the rural folk to converse with him in their own tongue, asking them at the same time to correct him when wrong in idiom or pronunciation. Well, as well as a grammar book and help from the Lampeter locals, Ollivant was taught by John Griffiths, the curate of Llangela in Carmarthenshire. As part of his vice principalship, Ollivant held the living at Llangela, and he resided there during the vacations, mixing with the parishioners, sharing the duties, including preaching, with Griffiths. And Griffiths was, we are told, a man of great capacity and unsurpassed as a Welsh orator, although I have a feeling that that appellation has probably been applied to more than one individual. Morgan, writing about Ollivant some years after his death, commented that this experience allowed him to become acquainted with the inner life of the Welsh people and competent with the common idiomatic tongue. And this observation is significant because so much of the criticism of Welsh learners at this period related to their inability to be understood by Welsh people or engage in ordinary conversation with them. Ollivant worked at Lampeter for 16 years. He was, of course, already a talented linguist, and if he spent a couple of months a year immersed in Welsh in Llangela and used the language in Lampeter town, that would surely have given him a firm grasp of the language. So it's my contention that Ollivant was a fluent Welsh speaker. Well, Ollivant went back to Cambridge for a few years to be Regius Professor of Divinity. And then he returned to Wales to be Bishop of Llandaff in 1849. Meanwhile, Thirlwall's academic career at Trinity College, Cambridge, which had started very promisingly, had ground to a halt. He was a vocal campaigner for Protestant dissenters being admitted to England's ancient universities on equal terms with Anglicans. He wanted Cambridge to stop behaving like a seminary with compulsory chapel and divinity lectures for all students. He wasn't the only person calling for this, but he was probably the most outspoken and persistent. And as a result of this, he was, rather controversially, dismissed from his tutorship at Trinity in 1834. It's a famous incident which brought Thirlwall to public attention. And of course, we can now see it as an important moment in the history of the two ancient English universities. Over the decades, of course, they moved in the direction that Thirlwall had been urging. So ejected from Trinity, Thirlwall moved to a small rural parish near York, where he spent most of his time on his academic work and developed a scholarly reputation that became respected throughout Europe. His 8-volume History of Greece was regarded as a masterpiece. And it's notable, actually, that most of the current scholarly interest in Thirlwall seems to relate to him as a significant 19th century classicist. His scholarship and his political opinions attracted the attention of the Whig Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who thought that Thirlwall might be an asset to the Whigs in the House of Lords. There is an intriguing account of the moment that Thirlwall's name was suggested to Melbourne by the MP Charles Buller in Froude's biography of Thomas Carlyle. It goes like this. Yes, Melbourne apparently said, but damn it, he's not orthodox in that preface to Schleiermacher. Buller replied that he thought Thirlwall, who he had known at Cambridge, was sufficiently orthodox for the purpose, and they adjourned to Melbourne's library, where they spent the mornings searching the church fathers for precedents for Thirlwall's opinions. Delicious story, even if slightly embroidered. And I certainly think that the notion of the Prime Minister spending the morning consulting the church fathers is an image to conjure with. Well, Thirlwall's dismissal from Cambridge had revealed him as a principled, liberal-minded advocate of religious and educational equality. As Bishop of St. David's, he controversially supported the British government's grant to the Roman Catholic Seminary in Maynooth, on the grounds that it was important for Catholic clergy to be better educated. He also saw the Maynooth grant as an act of reparation for previous injustices inflicted by the British on Irish Catholics. And in the quietly sensible manner that characterises much of his writing, he pointed out that the accusations of error and idolatry, which of course were hurled at Roman Catholics all the time at this sort of period, were misapplied. Roman Catholicism was, he said, simply a complicated system of doctrine in which truth and error are combined and blended together. I think one of Thirlwall's really appealing features is the way in which he seemed able to enter into considering all sides of a question. The appointments of Thirlwall and Ollivant as bishops drew strong criticism in Wales and hostility towards Thirlwall was particularly intense. One of the most vocal campaigners against his appointment was David James, known as Dowie or Ddyfed, who was actually Vicar of Kirkdale in Liverpool and closely aligned with the pressure group known as the Association of Welsh Clergy in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Now, this group, originally formed as a dining society in 1821, had been pressing for native Welsh bishops since the passing of the 1838 Pluralities Act, which required Welsh-speaking clergy to be appointed to Welsh-speaking parishes, but was silent on the issue of bishops. David James wrote an open letter to Thirlwall, telling him that he was totally unsuitable and that if he accepted the post, he would be doing evil to the people of Wales. His tone is curiously similar to that of a social media troll, I think. It is to be hoped you fling back with high and dignified disdain the poor bishopric of St. David and demand a better one in England, where you may enjoy the emoluments of the sea without inflicting present and eternal injury on the inhabitants. Twitter's got nothing on him. Well, Thirlwall told his friend Thomas Carlyle, in the middle there, that he lay awake for 3 nights considering whether he should accept the post. The accusation that he was only interested in the money was particularly unfair. In fact, Thirlwall used a great deal of his episcopal income, about £40,000 in actual Victorian pounds, not transferred into today's prices, to fund projects in his diocese over the course of his long period at St. David's, so over £1,000 a year. It's been suggested, it's been suggested that Thirlwall only bothered to learn Welsh because of David James's letter. But it seems obvious to me that it's something he would have done anyway. He had help from Joshua Hughes, the future Bishop of St. Asaph, who happened to be the Vicar of Abergwili at the time, and also from his chaplain. As he was confidently multilingual, he would have expected to pick up the language quickly from books. Just 7 weeks after his consecration, he wrote to his friend Monckton Milnes on 26th of September 1840, so very soon, with the news that I am learning Welsh much faster than I expected, and I can now read any common Welsh book with tolerable ease. Wow. Some years later, he referred to owning the manuscript of Gambold's Grammar and Dictionary, and he commented that the grammar was the most useful I know for the initial mutations. For a more advanced student, and as a guide to the etymology and syntax, I should recommend Rowland's, of which I lately received a copy of the 3rd edition from the author. Well, there seems little doubt that he rapidly acquired a reading knowledge, grasped the grammar, and was able to write the language accurately. The many neatly written Welsh sermons that survive in Thirlwall's hand, a couple of them on the screen here, suggest that unlike most learners, he rarely seemed to need to cross anything out. Speaking, however, proved more challenging. On his first Sunday in Abergwili, he pronounced the blessing in Welsh, and it was announced that he would preach in Welsh at Nevern. But preaching in Welsh so soon was clearly too ambitious. And to add to the pressure, an immense congregation assembles to witness the feat. According to John Morgan, who was present, the sentences were of wonderfully exact construction, but the pronunciation was largely unintelligible. Now, this episode is well known and oft repeated, but my commentary on this is to comment really that Thirlwall was in Wales for a further 31 years after this, and it seems likely that his pronunciation would have improved, even if he did still sound rather English. He also suffered from some degree of deafness, which wouldn't have helped. But the spectacle of Thirlwall's first Welsh sermon at Nevin was repeated and used as a solemn warning against promoting Welsh learners. Morgan, who's very fair to Thirlwall, I feel, commented that Thirlwall tried very hard, but with all his assimilating capacity, the language never really became his own. Perhaps this isn't very surprising in view of his character and circumstances. He was a solitary intellectual, happiest with his books and his numerous domestic pets, although the 1861 census reveals that his household included 3 children under 6, 2 great-nephews and a great-niece. He initially brought his servants with him from Yorkshire, but presumably he spoke Welsh to those that he recruited locally. He would have used English with the clergy, and it's difficult to imagine him chatting to the locals or immersing himself in a Welsh-speaking parish, as Ollivant had at Llangela. As a mid-century Lord Bishop of St David's, he did, of course, have to maintain the conventional dignity of his office. People sometimes found him cold and reserved, but perhaps that was a cover for shyness and the fact that his intensely active mind was always somewhere else. Thirlwall was Bishop of St David's during one of the most notorious episodes in the history of modern Wales, the 1847 government report into Welsh education, known as Brad y Llyfrau Gleision, the treachery or the treason of the Blue Books. It was, in the words of the historian Kenneth Morgan, the Glencoe and Amritsar of Welsh history. Denounced at the time and ever since as the product of English and Anglican prejudice and ignorance, its circumstances remain very familiar to anyone with an interest in Welsh history. But just in case you're unfamiliar, I will say a little more. The 1847 report was really the latest in a sequence of attempts to gather statistics on Welsh schools. Almost as an afterthought, the commissioners were invited to comment on the general condition of society and its moral and religious progress, using whatever sources might be available. The result runs to over 900 pages, and it's a very large format document as well. 900 pages of excruciating detail, statistics mixed with frequently hostile anecdotes. In this respect, actually, the document reminds me of the religious census of 1851. There, the remit was to gather data on the number of places of worship and the extent to which the available seating was used. But the result, in addition to statistics, was an extended discourse on Britain's religious history and doctrine, and the coining of the term unconscious secularism. Just as the 1851 religious census is sometimes seen as marking the beginning of the secularisation debate, so the reaction against the Welsh Education Report has been seen as marking the starting point for the development of modern nationalist historical perspectives. Hence its enormous and continuing significance in the historiography. And both documents were also crucial in politicising English and Welsh nonconformity, with a close alliance developing between the English Congregationalist Edward Mile and the Welsh Congregationalist Henry Richard. Thirlwall's thunderous denunciation of the report was, suffice it to say, quite different from the response usually attributed to Anglicans, particularly English ones, although he was not, of course, the report's sole Anglican critic. Sensible and logical, as usual, Thirlwall highlighted the sheer stupidity of carrying it out in the first place. He had stood up in Parliament in the House of Lords some months earlier and argued that what was needed was not a report, but significant government money to fund schools in Wales. He regretted that not only had the commissioners been invited to speculate on Welsh morality, but they had foolishly done so. Here's a flavour of what he had to say. And when no authentic statistics could be obtained, I very much doubt whether either sweeping assertions on the morals of a district or of the country at large, or of particular instances of flagrant turpitude, were of value sufficient to counterbalance the mischief of the irritation that they were likely to produce. Needless to say, whatever immorality might be present in Wales, worse would be found in parts of England. Furthermore, the report's investigation into the means afforded to the labouring classes of acquiring a knowledge of the English language appeared, he said, to lend a handle to those who wish to represent the Commission as an engine framed for the purpose, among others, equally injurious, of depriving the people of Wales of their ancient language. He repeated the views that he'd expressed some years earlier about the place of Welsh in schools. Children who spoke Welsh should be taught to read it. Welsh books should be provided. The language should be used during school hours, and the teachers should use both languages in order to communicate with their pupils in the most effective manner. How did our two bishops get on with Protestant nonconformity, which was one of the most obvious features of 19th century Welsh life? Well, Thirlwall's deeply liberal disposition and belief in religious education led him to suggest that nonconformist ministers should be invited into parish schools to provide religious instruction for the children of their denomination, a suggestion which created astonishment among many Anglicans. Ollivant considered that without the efforts of the nonconformists, the people of his diocese, Llandaff, would have been consigned to practical heathenism. Ollivant was an avid reader of the Welsh language nonconformist press, often summarising key points in his addresses to his clergy. He was pleased with the amount of Welsh medium chapel provision available in London. In a sermon on the topic of the perceived irreligiosity of the London Welsh in 1856, he addressed himself to all persons in Wales who call themselves Christians, whether churchmen or dissenters. He thought that Wales's religious diversity led to religious indifference, the phenomenon of too many options being available. And naturally, he would have preferred everyone to be an Anglican, but he avoided picking fights with the major denominations of Welsh nonconformity. His tolerance did not, however, extend to Unitarians. It rarely did. Mormons, even less frequently, or Roman Catholics. He had a different view from Thirlwall on Roman Catholics. But the interesting thing about this sermon, his sermon on the London Welsh, is that we can see that he's really thinking of himself here as a Welshman in Wales, worried about the behaviour of his countrymen in the capital city. Thirlwall, who did actually have some Welsh blood on his mother's side, described himself as a hybrid, a mixture of a Saxon and a Celt. He was much criticised for showing his so-called Saxon tendencies when he tried to suppress his clergy's preaching festivals, on the grounds that it was unseemly for ministers to be drawn into display and competition with their brethren. And he thought it was likely to lead to an overvaluing of one part of the service, i.e. the sermon, at the expense of the liturgy as a whole. And let's be honest, preaching festivals are not really very Anglican. I don't think it was anything to do with being Saxon. But his Celtic side was evident when he encouraged the revival of the national Eisteddfod. And he was admitted to the Gorsedd of the Bards in 1864, something which seems to indicate the respect in which he was held by Welsh Wales. Thirlwall's letters reveal his very serious and knowledgeable interest in Welsh music, language, and folklore, and he wanted to understand them within the context of European musical, language, and folklore traditions. He was preeminently, I think, a Europeanist. Thirlwall may have disliked competitive preaching, but both bishops were, unsurprisingly, believers in the efficacy of the sermon. Analysis of the piles of Thirlwall's Welsh sermons in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth would reveal the extent to which they were likely to have been suitable for the occasion on which they were preached. I think there's definitely a PhD topic there for somebody. As far as his delivery was concerned, as I've indicated, it seems unfair to condemn him on the basis of how he sounded at Nevern after only a few weeks in Wales. Ollivant, however, returned to Wales as a confident Welsh speaker. And John Morgan tells us how the bishop had once unexpectedly appeared at a Welsh service that he was conducting. Afterwards, in the vestry, he quizzed Morgan, who was then a young curate, about his sermon, suspecting correctly that he had taken it from a printed collection of English sermons and translated it. He then took the occasion, in a kind but earnest manner, to impress on me the duty of cultivating reality in my discourses, reality in sentiment as well as in speech. Well, Ollivant evidently wanted sincere Welsh preaching and not translations of other people's material. So let me now begin to offer some concluding thoughts. The legacy of both bishops is considerable. They laid the foundations on which the revival of the Welsh Church in the second half of the 19th century was built. Thirlwall founded Trinity College, Carmarthen, and during his episcopate, 183 churches were restored, together with some new builds, and many new parsonages and schools were opened. Ollivant maintained strong support for St David's College, Lampeter, this institution, and many of his clergy were trained here at the college. In Llandaff, 170 churches were rebuilt or restored, together with the cathedral. So 350 churches, new churches built during the period of these two bishops. And of course, Ollivant also encouraged a massive programme of school building. So these were the first generation bishops of the Reform era. The equalisation of episcopal stipends meant that there was no incentive to move them to English sees, which would once have been more lucrative. So they both stay in Wales. Both men gave lengthy service to the Welsh Church, which is another aspect of their parallel lives, actually. Thirlwall was at St David's for 34 years, and Ollivant was at Llandaff for 33. As a much-loved Welsh bishop, he was buried in the grounds of Llandaff Cathedral under an enormous Celtic cross. I couldn't find a picture of the Celtic cross, so that's obviously his tomb. Thirlwall, the scholar, was honoured with the rare distinction of burial in Westminster Abbey. And after the English inscription and the Latin inscription comes Gwyn ei ddyd. It was the first time that Welsh words had been carved into the fabric of the abbey. Arguments about alien versus native Welsh bishops continued for decades, and the style of Welshness exemplified by Thirlwall and Ollivant remained, I think, largely unnoticed. Today, one can imagine news of the appointment of a bishop with qualities similar to Ollivant being warmly welcomed. Well-speaking, friendly, keen on ecumenism, lay ministry and evangelism, concerned about poverty, an able administrator, and with a solid background teaching in Welsh higher education. What's not to like? I can imagine him or her. Thirlwall, a unique and fascinating character, is perhaps harder to imagine in his 21st century form. Probably safe to say that such a person would almost certainly not have got ordained, but I can imagine him or her as a Welsh public intellectual, possibly connected to a university, spotted on the mice at the National Eisteddfod, and providing intellectual heft for S4C and BBC Wales, a respected commentator on Welsh culture and politics, sometimes viewed through the lens of Europe or the world beyond. Thirlwall and Ollivant, I think, deserve to be remembered as prototypes for a modern form of Welshness and not as relics from a bygone age.